During the latter part of 2021, until the time I was writing this in the fall of 2024, I had severe depression and did kick around suicidal thoughts if I was having moments of weakness that were strong enough. It all started when a string of unfortunate events unfolded in the fall of 2021, causing this. Not to get sidetracked on my depression, but I am doing much better during the time of this story. I had just turned 20, and I was still going to my pediatrician for good visits, as I was allowed to, until I turned 23. Sitting in the waiting room, filled with colorful animal paintings on the wall and toys scattered on the ground, while you have little kids gawk at you with a full beard, isn't the most comfortable experience, might I add. Anyway, my mom wanted me to talk to my doctor about my depression since I was never open with it, and she did come with me that day for moral support. Well, in my mind at the time that was a mistake, and my doctor sent me to the ER. Upon getting there, I knew things would be going downhill when the doctor called me over and told me to leave my phone, keys, wallet, and other things in my pockets with my mother, or else security would take them. I was walked back through a room with other people with other issues. Not depression, but people with severe mental disabilities, people being weaned off of drugs, and other problems might need supervision. The hospital staff was also rather unprofessional. I was walked back to an empty white room with nothing but a tiny bed in the center of the room, on a steel box spring bolted down to the floor, and a plastic mattress that felt like you were laying on a bag full of charcoal and a blanket that was as thick as a paper towel. Also, a giant plastic chair in the center of the room filled with sand and bolted to the floor by one leg. The hooks surrounding the bed didn't make me feel any better. My best guess at the time was if they needed to strap a patient down. God forbid that happens to anyone during my stay here, I thought. It took 3 hours to see my mom, though I was told it would be 30 minutes. I took one 15-minute nap in the scrubs they gave me, but was constantly awoken by people being loud outside my door. Now, this door isn't going to be like a normal door. No locks on my side, however. The staff could lock me into my room if they wanted to. The actual door handle was a paddle that either side could push, and it would swing the door in or out of the room. No door stops either, it just closes on the socket. I am sort of ashamed to say that closing the door did take some getting used to. You had to let go of the paddle at the right time for it to shut properly. Anyway, my parents usually stayed with me for the whole day until 10:30 p.m. I am sorry to say that when I described my problems to my nurse, I was hit with a 201 form. Basically, a form saying I must go to extensive care. It requires a voluntary signature saying that you agree to go to extensive care for a minimum of 3 days, and it doesn't go on your permanent record. However, if you don't sign, you will be forced to go to extensive care for 5 days, and it will go on your permanent record. I know, doesn't sound very voluntary to me, more sounds threatening. Me, my mom, my dad fought the main doctor to allow me to leave, since clearly I didn't want the help I was being forced to have. But try as we might, there was no way we were going to force her hand, and we had to admit defeat. I stayed in that room for 2 days, doing nothing. Eventually, one morning, my mom visited me. The weight of 1,000 tons lifted off my shoulders whenever I saw my mom or my dad, since only one could come in at a time. It didn't make me feel alone, and it was my only source of entertainment. They couldn't have their phones, wallets, keys, or anything, not even their shoes. Me and my mom talked for a few hours. Sophie, the main nurse on duty, and bless her heart, she was the best nurse I had there, would constantly check up on me. Sophie felt more like a friend than a nurse, and I was grateful for that. She was amazing at her job, and I think she understood entirely what I was going through at the time. They had admitted a new patient that day. Not entirely sure what her issue was, but let's say she wasn't the quietest. The first thing me and my mom heard of her were her screaming, "Get the fuck out! Get the fuck out! I won't talk to you! Get the fuck out of here!" My mom saw her standing at the doorway outside her room to a nurse in her room. The nurse was male, so I could only assume she had some trauma with male figures. They did eventually calm her down, and she went back to her room. After about 10 minutes, she came out of her room and started singing opera music. She did have a beautiful voice, but it was sort of creepy, and after another 10 minutes, it started to get annoying. Sophie, on one of her checkups with me, said, "I know this sucks, but hey, at least you're getting serenaded while you're here." She was very good at lightening the mood. This carried on for about an hour until she eventually went into the middle of the lobby between all the rooms and started saying, "Wake up." Quiet at first until it turned into an absolute hollering, like she was a dog. This girl was driving me insane, and she was so annoying. The nurses quieted down, and I sort of lost track of time. I didn't hear much of her until I heard struggling outside my door. I heard nurses trying to disable a patient. I heard faint cries and yells until eventually I heard a male nurse say, "Hey, that's not your room," and a thud against my door. This girl was trying to get into my room. She was screaming bloody murder in a scary, deep yell. She wouldn't stop. She must have collapsed her lungs. My mom, thank goodness for her, sprang off the plastic chair in my room and held the door. I was in utter shock until I eventually came to my senses and held the door too, trying to not allow it to swing into my room or out. Through the ruler-sized window my door was given, I could see her trying to be restrained by multiple nurses, male and female, and 3 security guards, all of which were struggling with her. All the while she kept screaming in a deep, commanding voice, "God, fear me. I see the light. Take me there. I can see God. Fear me." She sounded possessed. They did eventually get her restrained, and I saw them carrying her by each limb back to her room. All the while she thrashed like a wild animal. My mom hugged me, crying, saying, "You don't need this. You don't." She told me she looked her right in the eyes and said if she came in, she would have kicked her teeth in. I am glad my mom was with me, or else I don't know what I would have done. My room was parallel to hers, so we saw them strap her down to her bed like we thought. She screamed and wouldn't stop. She screamed like she was being stabbed to death. They did eventually give her a shot of something. It calmed her down for a second until she started back up again. No one even came to my room asking if we were okay. Some care facility we were in. She screamed for hours and hours until night came, and she tired herself out, I assume. It was hard to get a decent night's rest after that. I had no clue what would have happened to me had my mother not been there to protect me. The next day, in the following afternoon, I thanked Sophie for everything she did for me, and I was wheeled out in a wheelchair by 2 retired cops who would be taking me to the extensive care facility. But before we headed for the door, I saw that woman one more time, staring at me through the tiny window in her door. I have no clue what would have happened that day if I was alone. I am scared to think about what would have happened. I am not sure I ever want to know. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City in northern Michigan during the summers with my parents. Traverse City, TC, is a beautiful place, produces 75% of the world's cherries, and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1989. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historical significance, the buildings on the hospital grounds were guarded by patrolling security guards. The TC Psychiatric Hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourism traps, cafes, etc. But many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel system, which the hospital staff used to safely transport the patients from building to building in the frigid winter temperatures. I am sure there were instances where the patients underwent cruel treatments or were subjected to the care of horrible doctors. But the TC Psych Hospital had a great reputation. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, were unashamedly fascinated with the hospital and its history. As a result, we would often break into abandoned buildings through unbarred windows or doors with pickable padlocks. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating for or trying to justify my criminal act of B&E, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors and walls, vandalism, strange, old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightened youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty ironic considering we made up most of those stories. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something that terrified me to the point I swore off ever returning. The story takes place around 10 p.m. The moonlight was dim and most patrol guards left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used and followed our regular path to one of the tall, jutting spires to sit by the windows that overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from our others, a new faint and unexplainable smoky odor. Not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint we almost thought we were imagining it, but it grew stronger as we got closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up to the spire, we followed the smell down a different hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grip my wrist so hard his nails left marks on my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with the sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead, bloodied bird surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind that I was raised devoutly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me I immediately started mumbling prayers, but I personally don't remember doing that. I wouldn't be too terribly surprised, though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us saying, "Welcome, friends." I promise you that there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way that guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed bloody murder, whipped around, and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men smiling at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which wouldn't be too crazy of a guess, considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I sprinted past the two, and I felt someone's fingers grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hand didn't have a solid hold on me because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The men shouted for us to stop running. We obviously didn't. We heard their footsteps chasing after us for a little while, but thankfully, Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. When we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather gotten caught by the guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot, whether the cause was fear, sprinting nonstop for 1.5 miles, or a combination of both. I'm not sure what would have happened if the occultists caught us, but I know for certain they weren't going to crack open a beer and sing Kumbaya by the candlelight. I'm not familiar with cultic practices or satanic rituals, so I'm not sure what the men were trying to do or if they were summoning something. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during that summer or any of the following summers. While we aren't close now that we're adults, I know that horrifying experience will keep us cemented in each other's memories until we die. I work as a brain surgeon, and I've seen many weird things inside people's brains. Tumors with hair, bits of random matter, and even once a brain falling apart. But this one patient had something wrong with them. This all happened only a few hours ago. She was a little girl with a strange lump on her head that I was assigned to remove. The X-rays showed this mass as a large tumor that seemed to be a growth of cells, so nothing really to worry about. We get the little girl on the operating table and reassure her everything will be okay once she wakes up. So we prepared the operating place and put the little legend to sleep. We begin the operation with no issues. As we open up the skin on her head, we notice that her skull seems to have molded itself into the shape of this tumor. But it didn't look like a tumor. We begin the process of opening her skull when she begins to seize. Her eyes swing open and they roll to the back of her head. Her mouth begins to ooze a black liquid that stinks like death. Her skull begins to crack and move as if this tumor was alive. The skull breaks open, spraying blood and brain matter all over the operating theater. My assistants squeal and run around the room in a frenzy. As I come to my senses, I look over at the poor girl. Crawling out of her skull looked like a large black spider, like the facehugger from Alien. It crawls out of the girl's skull, revealing its large fangs, long black legs, but no eyes. One of my assistants screams in terror and attempts to run out of the room. But as she gets only halfway to the door, this thing leaps from the girl's skull and onto my assistant. Everyone in the room squeals in horror as this thing begins to hack at my assistant, puncturing her body with its huge fangs to the point it had created a huge hole in her back. It then uses its claw-like legs to rip open the remaining flesh in her back before chowing down on her spine. Everyone in the room began to scramble to the door. Once we were all out, we locked it from the outside and put the entire hospital on high alert. But as the patients and staff began to evacuate, this thing broke the glass of the door and charged toward one of the older patients. It leaps onto the old man and bites him. He screams in pain as that black liquid the girl had oozing from her mouth begins to stream out of his mouth and eyes. The creature hisses as it kind of shoves the man over and begins to dig into the men back, as it did to my assistant. Seeing this, the people in the hallway begin to run away in a complete frenzy. As I run along with them, I look back at the thing to see it growing bigger and bigger until it was half the height of the door. I dart my head back around as the people's screams are silenced with a deafening screech coming from behind us. As the crowd of running people enter the lobby, we suddenly stop as the lobby is crowded with people attempting to escape. But the doors are locked as someone initiated lockdown. Suddenly, from across the lobby, the huge spider comes running, slaughtering the people in front of it. All the people scatter, and the entire lobby is filled with screams and cries of people trying to make their way through the ocean of people I and my other assistant charge toward an open elevator behind us, just before it closed. We all get in and take a sigh of relief. But just as the doors open on whatever floor the elevator took us, the floor of the elevator was impaled by a black claw. The spider had managed to break through the bottom floor door and crawl up the elevator shaft. Luckily, the second floor doors opened just in time as the creature began to rip open the floor. The hallways are still flooded with people in complete panic. Me and my assistants rush toward the closest staff room and take as many people with us as we can. We manage to get around 30 or 40 patients and staff inside before we lock and barricade the door. We all stand in silence, listening to the commotion outside the staff room. Suddenly, we hear a loud crash and the screaming getting louder. We hear the monster screech once more before blood sprays all over the windows of the staff room. It's now silent. The lights went out not too long ago, and now and then we can hear footsteps and quiet whispering move past the staff room, shortly followed by a scream and the sound of bones breaking. It's been nearly 3 hours since we first saw that thing climb out of that little girl's skull. All we know is that it is a vile parasite that would have killed that girl no matter what. We are calling it the Skull Burster, and since the operation, I have read on my phone that people's heads have been spontaneously bursting and revealing huge spiders inside. I think the city is overrun by these things. Beware of the Skull Bursters.